And we're going to talk about why bad things happen to God's people. You may have heard, I think there's a book called Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about why they happen to us, to God's people. Because bad things do happen to God's people, and it's not always because we've disobeyed God in some way. There are some other factors that come into play. And so I want to clear that up this week, just for the record, I guess. So anyway, let's get right into it. Why do bad things happen to God's people? Number one is what we talked about last week. When we disobey God's commands, He disciplines us as a loving Father. So this is just what we were talking about last week. Yes, it is true that when we don't follow God's commands, then we get disciplined by Him, especially as His children. Hebrews 12, verse 6 says, "For those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines." And so sometimes we think the Christian life is just rosy and everything's going to go good for us. We forget that now we are children of God, and as our Father, He does discipline us as a loving Father. Verse 11 says, "All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful." I don't know if you realize that or not, but discipline is not a pleasant thing usually, but sorrowful. Yet, to those who have been trained by it afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Now, years ago, when we were living down in California, I've shared this before with you, that I had a job in a carpet store, and my job was to go out and measure people's houses that wanted to get new carpet. And so it happened that we got an order for somebody that lived out in Palm Springs, which was quite a ways away from where we were. We were down in Orange County. And so they assigned me to go out there on a Saturday. And the guy that assigned it to me said, "You know, when you go out to Palm Springs, you're going to be on I think it's Highway 10, and or Freeway 10. And he said, you can just drive as fast as you want, because there's no cops out there." And I was naive enough to try that. And so I wound up with a ticket that day. And when I got home, I shared that with Ann, and our oldest son then was about 3 years old. And I said, "Yeah, Daddy got a ticket." He said, "What's a ticket?" And I said, "Well, that's where the policeman pulled me over on the road and is going to make me pay some money." He said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I did something wrong. I drove too fast. I broke the rules. And so now I get punished for that." He said, "Oh, you mean like a spanking?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's kind of like a spanking." And I'm sure in his mind he saw the policeman pulling me over his knee and spanking me, but it was the concept that he had. And yes, we do get sort of a spanking from God when we disobey, or a ticket. So anyway, that was what we covered last week. But moving on, there are 8 things today. 8. I only have 5 fingers. But we're going to cover 8 points real quickly of other things that can cause us to suffer pain or suffer adversity. And they're not always because we've done something wrong. All right, number 2. Sometimes we suffer through no fault of our own because of an accident. Luke 13, Jesus was talking and teaching, and he said, "Or those 18 who died when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, do you think that they were more guilty than the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish." So the question had come up to Jesus. Now Siloam was an area of Jerusalem, sort of outside the city. And this tower had fallen and it killed 18 people. And so people were wondering, were they big sinners? That those were the ones that died? And Jesus said, no, this was an accident. Things like this happen. We live in a fallen world. And so, in fact, Jesus went on to say that in this world we will have tribulation. Now, he said, but don't fear because I've overcome the world. But he did say, in this world things happen. The world is under a curse for now. And so sometimes things happen that we're not planning on. Years ago, we lived over on the coast in Florence, and there's not a whole lot to do in Florence. And so if you want to go shopping or do something really fun, you have to go to Eugene. Eugene's the closest big city. So we were in Eugene for the day, and we were driving back home to Florence. And in those days, it was just a 2-lane, narrow, windy road that went from Eugene to Florence. And so we were driving home. It was kind of a rainy day, and I'll remember I was driving, and all of a sudden we came around a corner, a turn, and there was a car that wasn't paying attention, and it was headed right for us. And it happened so fast that I tried to swerve, but I knew there's no way I can avoid this unless the driver catches himself, which by the grace of God he did. He caught himself right at the last second and was able to veer off and get back in his lane. But my life flashed before my eyes. I said, there's no way I'm going to be able to avoid this. And sometimes those things happen in our lives that no fault of our own, it just was an accident. And we can suffer pain from that. But fortunately, that didn't happen at that time. John 16:33, Jesus said, "These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Now, some of the things that we call accidents aren't really accidents. I mean, the insurance company may qualify them as that, but it really was maybe a little lapse of judgment on our part. And that's going to bring us to point number 3, and that is foolishness. Many things that we call accidents are really just a result of foolishness. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, you all know this verse, "But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And then the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Now, the person that built the house on the sand could have gone to their insurance company and claimed this was an accident. But was it really? It was foolishness, wasn't it, on the part of the builder? Paul addresses this kind of thing in Acts 27. We're not going to read that. The whole chapter actually goes into this account of when Paul was a prisoner and he was by ship going back to Rome. And so they got stuck on this island, the island of Crete, and it was getting late in the year, and apparently in that area, the later you get in the year, like here, the weather changes, and it gets real stormy on the seas, so much so that it's not very wise for ships to sail. And so Paul was pointing this out to the captain of the ship, but the centurion that was in charge of all the prisoners, which there were over 200 prisoners on this ship, was in a hurry to get back to Rome. And so he said, "No, we're sailing, even though the weather is a little choppy. I think we can make it." Well, it was a foolish decision, and they spent 15 days at sea just being tossed every which way. And finally the ship wrecked. By the grace of God, everyone was saved, but it was a foolish decision. When our second son was in high school, he was on the track team. And they had a track meet over in Sisters. Now, this was in the month of May, in the spring of the year, when the snow has stopped. There's no ice on the road, and the roads are clear, and you don't have to carry chains or anything like that. So it was on a Friday afternoon, and I thought, I'll just take the afternoon off, and I'm going to drive over and enjoy that track meet. So I did. And on the way home, I picked him up there and we were coming back. Well, all of a sudden the weather changed right on top of the mountain and it started to snow in the middle of May, for goodness sake. And so all of a sudden we got to the crest of the mountain, we're starting to come down, and the car was out of control. I was trying to steer it, but it had a mind of its own. Have you ever had that happen to you where you lost it? You're in an ice or snow and the car just is going to go. And fortunately, it wound up going to the mountain side of the ditch instead of the cliff side. And so it did a little damage to the car, but then my son got out and he said, Dad, have you looked at your tires lately? I said, no. He said, there's no tread on them. And so that was kind of foolish on my part. You could call that an accident, but really it was negligence on my part. So, if you built your house next to a toxic waste dump, you might get sick. It could happen. There are consequences when we do foolish things. All right. Number 4, ignorance. Bad things can happen to God's people simply because we did not have enough knowledge to know the consequences of our actions. Now that may have happened to you. Things went wrong, you didn't know why, because you just didn't know enough. Hosea 4:6. God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Isaiah 5:13, therefore my people have gone into captivity because they have no knowledge. And God was actually chewing out the priests of that day because they hadn't been teaching the people wisdom. And so here they were going astray and no one was trying to get them back on track. So sometimes things go wrong just because we didn't know. We didn't know any better. When I got my first car, no one told me that you had to change the oil in your car. And I had an old 65 Volkswagen, and it was a good German engineering, but not everything was labeled like it is today. And so there was this little green light on the dashboard, and I didn't really know what it meant. It's kind of a pretty light, and it was always on. And so I thought, well, that's good. But one day I was driving along, and that green light turned red. And I thought, well, that's a little variation now. We got some better color here.
Like you said,
but
Christmas.
it was Christmas time. And, green and red, I'm maybe just keeping in the spirit of the season. Well, I didn't realize it, but when I read the manual later, that meant that you were low on oil and you needed to change it or at least put some in. But I didn't know that. No one had told me that. And so I was driving down the freeway shortly after that, and all of a sudden a plume of smoke came out the back of the car, and it didn't run as fast after that. And so I had blown the engine because nobody told me you had to change the oil every 3,000 miles. So anyway, that was a hard lesson to learn. So sometimes things go wrong because we just didn't know. No excuse, but anyway, we didn't know. Number 5, we may go through testing to reveal to ourselves and to spiritual forces how strong or weak our faith is. So now we're getting a little deeper here, not just superficial things, but it could be a spiritual warfare that's taking place. Peter was a great follower of Christ, and he had great potential, and he was going to be the guy that would stand up on the day of Pentecost and give a sermon, and 3,000 people were converted just like that, and the church began. But leading up to that, Peter was kind of an impetuous guy, kind of a guy that you never knew what he was going to do. He might just do something out of the spur of the moment. He might just jump out of the boat and try to walk on water. That's the kind of a guy he was. And so apparently the devil had appealed to God and said, God, I want to sift Peter like wheat. In Luke 22. Jesus said, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." But Peter said to him, "Lord, with you I am ready to go to prison and even to death." Peter had kind of an exaggerated sense of confidence that he would never fall, he'll never fail. Come whatever, it's going to work out, Lord. Well, Satan saw that, and he demanded, or he asked if he could work. And sometimes that happens in our life. When God has something great for us, we might go through a time of testing before that, in preparation to build our character. And when Peter denied the Lord 3 times, he did some soul searching after that, and he was a different person after that. Did you notice that? He's a different person when you get to the book of Acts than he was as a disciple of Christ. And it was because he had gone through some testing. And so sometimes God puts us through that. In fact, you remember the story of Job. And God was showing off Job to the devil. The devil came before the Lord. And the Lord said, "Have you seen my servant Job?" And Satan says, "Well, just let a few bad things happen to him. He's so blessed, and you've got a hedge around him. How could he help but be a great guy? But just put him through some adversity, and then we'll see what happens." And so there was a little test set up, unbeknownst to Job. Nobody told him that he was going to be going through some severe testing. He was going to lose his children, were going to be killed catastrophically. He was going to lose his health. He was going to lose all his possessions, everything. Nobody told him that. They didn't tell him otherwise that in the end, he was going to get back twice as much as he had in the beginning. And so he got a little disillusioned along the way. And sometimes we do too when we're going through suffering and we don't realize that God is building us for something better. Something better is down the line. James 1 sums it up like this in verse 12. It says, "A man who endures trials is blessed, because when he passes the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." So sometimes we're going through a test, and we don't even realize it, and there's a reward at the end that we don't see. But if we can see that, hey, Lord, this is just only a test, okay, I can endure that. All right, number 6. Paul was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him from becoming conceited, because he received great revelations from God. So Paul was in ministry. Paul had a special calling on his life. And to fulfill that, the Lord himself appeared to Paul and taught him face to face, firsthand, these great things that we now have in the New Testament. But the tendency with Paul then was that maybe he would get a little pride. It would be easy, wouldn't it, to have some spiritual pride if you wrote most of the New Testament. You might have a tendency to get all puffed up. In fact, one of your verses there, 1 Corinthians 8, 1-2 says, "But knowledge puffs up." It causes us to get conceited. Knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. And so Paul was in danger of that, and because of that, the Lord gave him a thorn in the flesh. You can read about it in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul says, "Because of these surpassingly great revelations, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, For my power is made perfect in weakness. And that could happen to us, that God has given us such a ministry that He has to keep us humble in some way. There might be something that we go through that seems like it's taking forever. All right, number 7. When we link ourselves closely with the wrong people, we can share their discipline, even though we may have done nothing wrong. Do you ever have that experience? That because you had a wrong friend, or maybe your kids, you could see it in your kids, they have this wrong friend. And I know with our daughter, she had one friend that those two gals, when they were separate, they were the most delightful people on the face of the earth. When they were together, they were hell on wheels. And look out. And, that could happen to any of us. It happened to Lot. Remember Lot? The Bible tells us that Lot was a righteous man. That Lot was a man of God. And what did he do? He decided that he would go and live in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, it wasn't such a great place. There were some bad things happening in Sodom and Gomorrah, and it affected Lot. That he came under discipline, he came under adversity, not because of anything that he was doing, but just because he was there, living there in Sodom and Gomorrah. 2 Peter talks about it. It says, God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and turned them into heaps of ashes. He made them an example of what will happen to ungodly people. But God also rescued Lot out of Sodom because he was a righteous man who was sick of the shameful immorality of the wicked people around him. Yes, Lot was a righteous man who was tormented in his soul by the wickedness he saw and heard day after day. So there it is. Lot was affected just by the things that were going on around him, and he suffered some adversity. Proverbs 12:26 says, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. We have to be careful who we closely associate with. Don't be unequally yoked, is the way the New Testament puts it. All right, finally, number 8, our last one. The highest form of suffering is when we are called to suffer for righteousness' sake. When we are persecuted for standing up for the cause of Christ. And so, certainly this could be true of anyone. It hasn't been so much in our country. There hasn't been a lot of persecution going on here, although in other parts of the world, it can get pretty rough. Think of Pastor Arun in India. He takes his life in his own hands because he takes a stand for Christ. He could be jailed at any moment for preaching. Or he could be, maybe worse, his life taken. Hopefully that doesn't happen in our country, but it could in the future, in the near future. 1 Peter 3 says, who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. And Jesus even said to his disciples, there's going to come a time where they're going to persecute you, they're going to put you in jail, you're going to have to go before governors and governments. And he said, don't worry about what you will say. I will give you the words when that happens. And so there's a special grace that comes upon us when we go through persecution, and there's a special reward in the end. All right, I'm wondering, are you going through adversity now in your life? Maybe you saw yourself in one of these points that we were talking about. When we do suffer, we mourn, don't we? There's kind of a groaning that goes on inside of us. And you know what Jesus said about people that mourn? He said they will be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And it may not necessarily be in this life. It may be in eternity where there's no more sorrow, no more tears. And that's for those who have received Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. If you've never done that, we want to offer that to you today. Consider that strongly. Do that. Not tomorrow. Do it today. Do it sooner, not later.